The interview you're about to see is with Father Ted Ross, a Jesuit and a church historian, who will be talking with us about the Second Vatican Council, an extremely important event in the history of the Catholic Church, which took place from 1962 to 1965. By way of introduction to Father Ross's presentation, I would like to quote a few lines from an excellent church history, a book called Saints and Sinners, A History of the Popes by Eamon Duffy. In this book, published by Yale University Press, the author writes that when Angelo Roncalli was elected in 1958 to become Pope and would take the name of John XXIII, the author says that on that day the world awoke to find a kindly, laughing old man on the throne of Peter, who knew the modern world and was not afraid of it. In part, it was because he had the freedom of an old man. There are some significant similarities between John XXIII and our current Pope, Pope Francis, in their way of speaking, their way of relating to people, their view of the church, their view of the world, and their understanding of the need that the church has to work for social justice and human rights and to work for a better world. The author continues, John XXIII was unconventional. He hated the white skull cap popes wear, which would not stay on his bald scalp. So he reinvented and wore the red and ermine cap seen in portraits of Renaissance popes. He cut through papal protocol and was a security nightmare, sallying out of the Vatican to visit the Roman prisons or hospitals. Under the warmth of his overflowing humanity, the barriers which had been constructed between church and world melted away. The author also goes on to talk about John XXIII's views of society. The personal warmth was matched by a willingness to rethink old issues. His first encyclical, Mater et Magistra, published in 1961, broke with Vatican's suspicion of lurking socialism by welcoming the advent of the caring state, and it insisted on the obligation of wealthy nations to help poorer ones. The CIA thought the Pope gave comfort to communists. Now, our current Pope, Pope Francis, has been speaking very clearly about the Church's preferential option for the poor, the need of the Church to be in service, especially of the poor, and the need for change in international relations and in the international economic system. And of course, like John XXIII, Pope Francis is beginning to receive some very strong criticism from those sectors of society which are in power and which are in positions of privilege. The author, Eamon Duffy, continues, staggeringly, less than 3 months after his election, John announced the calling of a general council on January 25th, 1959. This council would, of course, be the Second Vatican Council, which made many significant changes and brought new breath of fresh life into the church. As Pope John XXIII had also said, he wanted to open up the windows of the stuffy church in order to let new and fresh breezes come in. Let us now listen to Father Ted Ross and his reflections on the Second Vatican Council. Today I have the privilege of interviewing Father Ted Ross, who is a professor of church history. And thank you, Ted, for being here.
My pleasure.
And I'd like to ask you about Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, which was 1962 to 65, and what, in your view, were some of the major developments in Vatican II? That would be the first question. And then, to what extent were these developments implemented, which leads to the question of what remains to be done?
The big pastoral revolution in Vatican II, I could put under three headings. It's the liturgy, the laity, and ecumenism. Now these are the things, these particular dimensions affect all Catholics and their lives are touched by them. Now, you can't really talk about one council without talking about all of them. There was a council before Vatican II called Vatican I, and it meets in 1870, and it is, now, the problem is that because of a war between France and Germany, it was shortened. So that it was, it lasted actually from December the 8th, 1869 to July of 1870. Now, it intended to get to most of the questions that Vatican II intended to get to, the laity and so on, but because of the war, they had to cut it short, so they took only two dimensions of what they were going to discuss at Vatican I, and that had to do with the papacy, its infallibility, and its primacy. So they just emphasized two, the primacy of the papacy and the infallibility of the papacy. Now these are all very true Catholic Orthodox positions. They didn't get to the relationship between church and state. See, as a result, all we got was the primacy and infallibility. These are all authentically Catholic, but to a certain extent, it tended to make the church top-heavy, without including the laity, without including theological input, without including, for example, a relationship between, for example, the laity and the hierarchy, and the hierarchy and the papacy, so that Vatican II had to complete Vatican I. Now, with Vatican II, in matter of fact, in the beginning, they had to answer the question, is Vatican II a different ecumenical council, or is it simply a continuation of Vatican I? And the bishops at Vatican II decided, no, it's a whole different council. But it's so closely connected to Vatican I that they had to actually ask that question. Now, so that you get, for example, ecumenism. I mean, I think all of us can remember some of the horror stories in the church before Vatican II in terms of our relationship with other religions. And I can recall, for example, I've given you an example. A very good friend of mine was an outstanding organist in a little town in Pennsylvania. And the Methodist Church got a brand new organ. And the Methodist Church, the Methodist minister came to my friend, who is now a religious, and said to her, we want you to try our organ. We want to get your opinion of our new organ, because she was the best musician in town. So she did what we all would have done. She went to the Monsignor to get permission to be able to play that organ in the Methodist Church, and he told her, you play the organ in that church, and you will never again play the one in our own. So you see, now, the horror stories, narrowness, maybe a type of defense of the church that was a bit extreme and possibly offensive. Now, in all of this, in other words, these are the different dimensions that Vatican II was trying to get at, because they were all important. But the big three had to do with our liturgy, the role of the laity, and our relationship to others, and also our relationship to the world. That came through with the church in the modern world. You get a social responsibility, political responsibility. They covered all the different dimensions of human existence. The family, for example, artists, scientists, all the different roles. Now, there was almost none of that in Vatican I. The whole idea was, it was basically religious, to be able to cut ourselves, to show the cleavage between the church and the world, and the church and other religions. Now, Vatican II tried to bring them together, So that, now, what did Vatican II accomplish? It accomplished quite a bit. Did it accomplish everything? No, it didn't. No council ever says it all. Cardinal Newman said, the mystery of Christ is too great for any one age or any one people to completely understand.
Now, Ted, as we come to a close of the first part of our interview on Vatican II, I would like to ask you, what do you consider the most urgent problem that Pope Francis has to face in the Church today?
The Curia. That's the church's secretariat. It has to be totally overhauled. The Holy Father has a strong authority given to it by Christ, but the Curia, it's not given to them by Christ. It's a human institution with all of the weaknesses of humans. Now the Pope has got to step in. There's that particular Curia has been given way too much authority in the church, and the Pope Francis is aware of that, and he has to come on the scene and take some of the cut the bottom out from a lot of these people that are as it were, making statements and making policies that are not to the good of the church.
As if they themselves were infallible.
Exactly.
I would like to add a little footnote to what Father Ross has just said about the Curia. And this again is from the book, which I quoted earlier, Saints and Sinners, A History of the Popes by Eamon Duffy. And here he says, recent studies of the origins of the Council have made it clear just how opposed to it the Vatican Old Guard were. The whole drift of Pacelli's pontificate, that is, the pontificate of Pius XII, preceding John XXIII, the whole drift of Pacelli's pontificate had been to subordinate the local churches and their bishops to the papal central administration, the Curia. The thought of assembling the world's 3,000 bishops and letting them talk to each other and maybe even have new ideas was horrifying. Vatican officials did what they could to block the preparations, and when it became clear that they could not prevent the council going ahead, tried to hijack its proceedings, to stack the preparatory committees, determine the agenda, and draft the conciliar documents. Lists of doctrines to be condemned mounted up, and 72 draft schema were prepared, all of them destined to be rejected by the council. So we see that the bishops at the Second Vatican Council began to have a strong sense of their own calling, their own responsibility for the church, and they went far beyond the narrow confines that had been set for the council by the Curia. And the author, Eamon Duffy, continues and concludes this part of his reflections on the council. For guidance, John XXIII turned to Cardinal Montini and the Belgian Cardinal Sunens. They saw that the council must center on the nature and role of the church, that it must be ecumenical in character, must present a pastoral, not a bureaucratic vision, that it must renew the liturgy and restore the notion of collegiality in the church, that is, the shared responsibility of the bishops with the Pope, no longer an isolated papal monarchy. So here we see a definition of collegiality in the church, the shared responsibility of the bishops with the Pope. This did not prosper very much, has not prospered very much since the Second Vatican Council. We're hoping that Pope Francis will move this forward so that collegiality will become more of a reality in the church.